In August 2022, 150,000 people in a United States state capital lost running water. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. Jackson, Mississippi had already been under a boil water notice for more than a year before the taps ran completely dry. The O.B. Curtis Water Treatment Plant, the city's primary facility, was built in 1914. Some of the pipes feeding Jackson's neighborhoods date to the 1920s. The EPA had documented Safe Drinking Water Act violations at O.B. Curtis in 2012, 2015, 2017, 2019, and 2020. 5 formal notices, 10 years of documented failures. Jackson's water crisis did not begin in 2022. That is the first thing you need to understand. The city's water system issued boil water notices in 8 of the 11 years between 2011 and 2022. 8 out of 11. That is not a crisis. That is a condition. A permanent state of managed failure that 150,000 residents were expected to absorb and live inside. The O.B. Curtis Water Treatment Plant opened in 1914. Many of the distribution pipes beneath Jackson's streets were installed in the 1920s through the 1960s. The average age of Jackson's water distribution network in 2022 was estimated between 70 and 80 years. The national average for United States water systems is 45 years. Jackson was running a system nearly twice as old as the country's baseline, under one of the highest poverty rates of any state capital in the United States. By 2022, EPA and city engineering estimates placed Jackson's total deferred infrastructure maintenance at a minimum of $2 billion. In a city whose entire annual budget ran around $700 million. In 2021, Texas lost water for 3 days during a winter storm. National media covered it for weeks. Congress held hearings. Billions in federal relief moved within months. Jackson lost water for months in 2022. It received a fraction of that attention and a fraction of that response. That gap is not a coincidence of geography or timing. The reason is embedded in 2 decades of decisions made, one legislative session at a time, about which city in Mississippi was worth keeping functional. Jackson's population is 82% Black. Its tax base represents less than 1% of total Mississippi state revenue. The capital of a state, generating less than 1% of that state's tax receipts. That number is not a fact of nature. It is the result of choices. And before you can understand the collapse, you have to understand who made them. The standard explanation for Jackson's water crisis goes like this. The city mismanaged its budget, neglected its infrastructure, and arrived at collapse through a sequence of bad decisions made by local officials. That story has one advantage. It is simple. It is also structurally incomplete. Here is what it leaves out. Mississippi law gives the state legislature direct authority over capital improvement funding to municipalities. Jackson cannot issue bonds above state-set limits without legislative approval. That approval, in Jackson's case, was blocked or delayed repeatedly through the 2010s. In 2008, Mississippi created a dedicated infrastructure maintenance fund, a pool of revenue intended to support city water and sewer systems. By 2016, the legislature had redirected significant portions away from Jackson through formula revisions embedded in House Bill 1419. HB 1419 restructured municipal aid calculations in ways that reduced Jackson's share of state infrastructure support. Meanwhile, Jackson's tax base was being eroded from outside its borders. As higher income, predominantly white residents moved into newly incorporated suburban municipalities, Ridgeland, Brandon, Flowood, those communities drew legal boundaries around themselves. Property tax revenue stayed within the new borders, but the pipe network extending under those suburban streets remained connected to Jackson's aging system. Suburbs drew water from infrastructure, They had legally separated themselves from funding. The city was the owner of a system it could not afford to fix, operating under rules it did not write, serving growth it could not tax. This is not mismanagement. This is a revenue trap, constructed through boundary lines, legislative formulas, and bond approval authority concentrated at the state level. The visible problem, the crumbling pipes, the failing pressure, the brown water, did not originate inside Jackson City Hall. It was engineered from the outside in. Nikisha Thurman lived on Jackson's south side. Her home sat approximately 2 miles from the Mississippi governor's mansion on Capitol Street. In August 2022, when O.B. Curtis lost pressure and the system failed, Thurman went without safe tap water for 63 days. She boiled water to wash dishes, to prepare food, to clean cuts and scrapes. She bought bottled water, case after case, at a cost she later estimated at more than $400 over the duration of the crisis, on a fixed income, in a city where the median household income was under $38,000. Her children's pediatrician raised the problem directly. Without reliable safe water, the family could not properly sanitize bottles, medical equipment, or wounds. These were not dramatic emergencies. They were slow, grinding daily risks, the kind that do not make headlines but compound quietly over weeks and months into genuine harm. During those 63 days, the National Guard and FEMA distribution sites provided bottled water at designated pickup locations. For residents without cars, volunteers hauled jugs to front doors. Thurman later described to reporters how each day collapsed into a logistics problem, tracking water levels, coordinating with neighbors, rationing what the household had left. 2 miles north, the governor's mansion maintained water pressure throughout the entire crisis. In the weeks before the full collapse, Governor Tate Reeves had described Jackson's water situation as a city management problem. He resisted calls for emergency state infrastructure funding, framing the failure as a consequence of local governance rather than state responsibility. The National Guard deployment was its own kind of detail. Federal and state military logistics deployed to hand out plastic jugs in a city the EPA had formally flagged as a critical risk water system for 5 consecutive years. The water existed. The system to deliver it through pipes had simply been allowed to deteriorate past the point of function. Thurman's experience is not an outlier. It is the median. 150,000 people, most of them black, most of them lower income, living in the capital city of a state that had been watching this coming for years. This is what it looks like when a government decides another government's problem is not its own. This is where the word neglect stops being adequate. Neglect implies absence, a failure to notice, to prioritize, to look. What the documentary record of Jackson's water crisis actually shows is something closer to the opposite. Active decisions, formal requests, documented denials, and a consistent, traceable pattern of who absorbed the cost. In 2018, Jackson Mayor Chokwe Antar Lumumba formally requested emergency state infrastructure funding for the water system. The legislature tabled it. He returned in 2019, in 2020, in 2021. In 2021, Lumumba submitted a formal request for $47 million in emergency water system aid. The Mississippi legislature allocated $3 million, not $47 million. 3. The Mississippi Department of Finance and Administration controlled the disbursement timing on federal pass-through infrastructure funds, money that originated in Washington but moved through state channels before reaching Jackson. City finance records documented that disbursement delays compressed the city's window to plan and execute repairs. The money moved slowly. The pipes did not wait. Now consider the political arithmetic. Jackson's population is 82% black. The Mississippi State Legislature is majority white and Republican. Jackson's votes do not determine statewide electoral outcomes. The city has no leverage, it cannot withhold votes that don't decide elections, and it cannot threaten economic consequences from suburbs that have already incorporated away from it. The incentive structure is precise. Suburban legislators had strong political reason to frame Jackson's failing water system as evidence of Black municipal incompetence, and no political cost for leaving the repairs unfunded. The framing was useful. The sustained underfunding was, for those legislators, costless. Who benefited? Suburban municipalities maintaining newer systems, legislators who avoided the political liability of a tax-funded repair to a majority Black city, and a durable political narrative circulating in state politics for years before the collapse that treated the failure as self-inflicted. Historians and civil rights researchers have documented the broader pattern. State governments defunding majority Black municipalities through funding formulas, boundary decisions, and administrative mechanisms that produce racially concentrated outcomes without naming race in the statute. Jackson fits that pattern with documentary precision. 5 formal EPA violation notices. A legislative funding ratio of $3 million returned on a $47 million request. Bond approval authority blocked. Federal pass-through funds delayed at the state level. This is not speculation about intent. It is a description of documented behavior and its outcomes. The pipes did not corrode from neglect. They were held in place while the resources to fix them were withheld. The paper trail on Jackson is not thin. That is what makes the inaction so striking. EPA Region 4 issued formal Safe Drinking Water Act violation notices for the O.B. Curtis plant in 2012, 2015, 2017, 2019, and 2020. 5 notices over 8 years. These are not informal warnings. They are legal documents identifying specific treatment deficiencies, pressure failures, and contamination risks, each requiring a formal corrective action response. In 2021, the Natural Resources Defense Council published a risk assessment of water systems across the South. Jackson was named explicitly as one of the most critically underfunded and deteriorated systems in the region. In the winter of 2020, a cold snap caused widespread failure across Jackson's water distribution network. Boil water notices covered the equivalent of 700,000 person days of exposure, 700,000 individual days on which a Jackson resident had to treat their tap water as unsafe to drink. The state declared a disaster. No emergency capital repair funding was allocated. In February 2021, a second major failure struck during another cold spell. Governor Reeves declared a second state of emergency. Again, that declaration unlocked no new repair capital. An emergency declaration, it turned out, was a designation that acknowledged a crisis existed. It was not a mechanism that compelled the state to fund its resolution. In 2019, Jackson City engineers presented the city council with a formal 10-year pipe replacement schedule. They stated plainly, in public council meeting records, that without $250 million in replacement funding, within the first 3 years, the system faced catastrophic failure risk. The state-controlled bond approval process produced zero new capital in response. Internal EPA communications, later obtained and published by the Mississippi Free Press, the nonprofit newsroom that had been reporting on this story for years before national outlets arrived, showed that EPA Region 4 officials had flagged Jackson as a critical watch system internally since at least 2017. That internal designation did not produce an emergency order. The emergency order came in August 2022, 10 years after the first formal Safe Drinking Water Act violation notice at O.B. Curtis. The Mississippi Free Press had been documenting the funding gaps, the legislative decisions, and the EPA correspondence long before the crisis became national news. When the taps finally failed completely, major outlets described a sudden collapse. The Free Press knew it as the final step in a sequence they had already traced in detail. The story was available for years. The attention was not. They knew. Not vaguely, not in passing. They knew specifically, with engineering reports, with formal legal notices, with internal risk classifications, with city council meeting minutes. The inaction was not ignorance. In August 2022, the EPA issued a formal emergency order under Section 1431 of the Safe Drinking Water Act, the provision that enables federal intervention when a situation presents an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health. For Jackson, that order came 10 years after the first documented violation at O.B. Curtis. The federal government appointed Ted Hennepin as third-party manager of Jackson's entire water system, an outside administrator federally installed, taking operational control of a municipal utility because the existing structure had failed completely. This was, to that point, an unprecedented intervention for a capital city in the United States. $600 million in federal infrastructure funds, drawn from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, were directed to Jackson, the largest single water infrastructure investment in Mississippi history. By early 2023, O.B. Curtis had been stabilized. The boil water notice, which had run continuously for more than a year, was lifted. Pressure was restored. National coverage moved on. Then Hennepin's team started replacing pipes, and the second reversal arrived. The network was so old and its internal connections so brittle that large-scale repair work in any one section consistently fractured adjacent segments. Hennepin's team documented that major pipe replacement in a given area was triggering 2 to 4 secondary breaks in neighboring infrastructure. The system could not be fixed incrementally. It required near-total replacement at a cost now revised upward to between $1.5 billion and $2 billion, roughly 3 times the federal allocation. And then there is this. Hennepin reports to a state-controlled oversight body, the same institutional structure that spent 2 decades blocking, delaying, and minimizing capital for Jackson's water system now supervises the terms of its reconstruction. The NAACP Mississippi State Conference and civil rights attorneys raised immediate public concerns about whether state control of the oversight process created a fundamental conflict of interest, placing the entity that failed to fund the system in charge of managing its repair. The $600 million is not nothing. In a city that received $3 million when it asked for $47 million, $600 million represents a genuine intervention. But the structural question remains. Who controls the pace? Who determines the priorities? Who oversees contractor decisions? The answer is a state government with a 20-year record on this precise issue. That record is documented and public. The fix was real. The pressure came back. But the fix also exposed the floor. And the floor turned out to be far deeper than the intervention could reach. Go back to the opening image. A Jackson resident on the south side, filling grocery bags with gallon jugs. 2 miles from the governor's mansion, in the capital city of the state of Mississippi. That image is not a picture of a city that failed itself. It is a picture of what a political system looks like when its choices solidify into physical form. The dry tap, the brown water, the boil notice that ran for more than a year before the system lost pressure entirely. These are not mysteries. They are the material residue of specific, documented decisions. The incorporation boundaries that stripped Jackson's tax base, the legislative formulas that redirected infrastructure funds, the bond approval powers that blocked capital, the EPA enforcement that accumulated 5 formal violation notices over 8 years and waited another 2 to issue an emergency order, the state emergency declarations that acknowledged the crisis and funded nothing. Every city in America has aging infrastructure. Pipes corrode, plants deteriorate, equipment fails across time. That is not the story here. The story here is that Jackson asked for $47 million and received $3 million. That EPA Region 4 flagged the city internally as a critical watch system in 2017 and issued its emergency order in 2022. That suburban municipalities incorporated themselves out of any financial obligation to the pipe network they still draw from. That the partial fix now answers to the same state oversight structure that created the conditions for collapse. The visible problem, the empty taps, the water jugs at distribution sites, the years of boil notices was not a management failure, it was a measurement, a physical record of what accumulates when a government decides a city is not worth the cost of maintaining. Jackson didn't run out of water, it ran out of political value.